breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence lawyer, not your typical pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters, a weekly podcast with Lizzie Green and Joe Crowley. Our episodes are available every Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Justice Matters Pod for clips. Enjoy the episode. This episode contains descriptions of murder and harm to babies. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, Lizzie.
Hello, Joe.
How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I am well. I think we're getting back to what we're best at, I'd like to think, which is some murder case.
I know. I'm bringing it back to the wholesome, happy, joyful topics that I always seem to find.
I know.
But this was actually a listener request.
Okay, good.
So it can't all be attributed to my ghoulish choice.
Well, you don't think you've got a ghoulish choice. I mean, it's a true crime podcast. I mean,
this is true. This is true.
Crimes are not happy, happy, joy, joy.
But I should say this is a tough one.
Yes.
Because it is the case of Lucy Letby.
Yes.
And so for those who don't know, Lucy Letby, it's a UK case. And so she was a neonatal nurse. So she worked in the nursery for babies that need extra care when they're born.
Yeah, so these are babies that have just been born. Just
been born, usually prematurely, or they have some health complications at birth, and so they need extra special attention in the neonatal unit.
Yeah.
So she worked at the Countess of Chester Hospital, and she was convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others between 2015 and 2016. That was the time of the offending.
Yeah.
I read the Court of Appeal judgment, so I'm going to talk about those charges in a bit of detail, but generally she was alleged to have used various methods in her treatment of these babies, including injecting air or insulin into their bloodstream, overfeeding the babies with milk or fluids, and 2 of the babies said it was trauma that was the cause of death.
Cause of death, trauma.
Some babies who survived actually survived multiple attacks. So they were resuscitated multiple times.
That was what the court found, or the jury found.
Yes.
But there's some question marks over that.
Well, I mean, there have been some recent developments or, proceedings. So we'll get to those. Yes. But she was tried it started October 22, went all the way through to August 2023, so a really long trial, 10 months.
Yes.
And then she was convicted. So she was sentenced to what they call in the UK a whole life order, which means she will never be released.
Yes. And it was said at the time she was England's worst serial killer or something.
Yes, I read an article recently that is still saying that about her.
Interesting. Yes, and I'm guessing that one of the reasons the trial runs for so long is because of the amount of evidence they need. Because I'm assuming you're not seeing babies that are bruised and battered. So if you look at these babies, you can't tell how they've died, and so they have to be autopsies done, and then they have to look back through medical records to find out who was doing what and things like that.
Well, and also, Joe, the sheer number of babies, because there were some charges that the jury did not reach a verdict on.
Yeah.
And there was a second trial in relation to one of those babies, and she was convicted of that as well. So if you think about the medical evidence and the number of babies, then it translates to a very long proceeding.
I've said before on this podcast, it is often very difficult to determine how people die. If you just have a body and there's no obvious wounds or bruising on the body, then that is not an easy thing to determine. And I'm not a doctor at all, but I understand that things can be even more difficult when you're dealing with babies.
Well, and also let's think about the fact that these babies were in the neonatal unit because their health was compromised already in some way, and that was something that defence highlighted.
Yeah.
I mean, there were clear, according to the expert evidence, there were clear indications of causes of death, like that they weren't coming to trial with cause of death unknown.
No, of course. By the time they get to trial, they've determined the cause of death.
Yes.
They need that to charge her with murder. And so, but my point was, it was, a long trial of about 9 months, 10 months. And that, I'm guessing, is because there had to be, there was lots of victims, but then there was, I'm assuming, lots of expert evidence about each victim.
Yes. So she did appeal, and that was an appeal based on a number of things: the medical evidence, the expert evidence, also some instructions to the jury. I'm not going to talk about those.
No, that's sort of a technical legal one.
Yeah, and also one allegation of juror misconduct.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, so I did want to touch on that because juries are, a particular interest of mine.
Yeah.
Yes. That appeal was actually refused in July of last year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then, so I want to talk through the case against her, and then we'll see what's developed since then. Okay.
All right.
So she was aged 33 at the time of conviction and sentenced, and there's a lot of photos of her online, and she looks lovely. Like she doesn't look like. I know you don't like it when I say
we do
this
this all the time. What did you expect her to look like? A big scar on her face and a cruel look in her eye.
So she was a qualified nurse working at the neonatal unit.
Yeah.
She was originally charged with 22 counts of murder in relation to 17 different victims.
Yeah. Already I'm thinking this is just fantasy land stuff, but yeah.
So you've pre-decided before I've even told you anything?
I haven't pre-decided, but from the moment I heard this case, I was like, this all sounds a bit odd.
Okay. All right. So the prosecution case at trial was that between 2015 and 2016, she serially harmed babies in her care with the intention of killing them. And she did so by various means. So the phrasing that we're going to talk about is by causing air embolus, by introducing air into the IV lines, by forcing air into the abdomen via nasogastric tubes.
So that's a tube that goes up the nose and into the stomach to feed
the little preemie
tubes.
babies. By force feeding milk, by poisoning through administration of artificial insulin into the IV bags, and physical trauma causing bleeding or internal injury. So I actually haven't gone in detail into all of those.
No.
But I did have a look at the first 4 victims. And that's because after the first 4 babies were identified, 3 of them died, 1 of them didn't, there was an internal review centering on those babies and the potential that Letby was involved. So they were babies A, B, C, and D.
But sorry, okay. So internal review, hospital has it has an interest in making sure that its processes aren't held to blame.
That's right.
But also they've got to determine that the care is not. Well, so they don't have to determine. They can determine that it's negligent, but the prosecution's got to say it's not just that she was a bad nurse; she was deliberately doing things.
That's right.
Stuff. Yeah.
So because of these babies A, B, C, and D, the hospital did have an internal inquiry, and that review was conducted by 2 of the consultants at the neonatal unit, and she was identified as being the common factor in the collapses and deaths, as in she was present for each of those, and I think was the only nurse consistently present for each of those.
Okay, well, I mean, that's just a statistical probability. And again, doctors have an interest in making sure it's not the care that they've been administering.
But what I want us to remember is that between that first informal review and the time she is removed from the unit, we went from baby D, so A, B, C, D, all the way up to baby P.
That's a lot of babies. How
it
many
is a lot of babies.
What's my math? I'm not math.
Is that the 17?
Is it? Jeepers.
And so I already am thinking somebody dropped the ball there, because babies E through to P, should not have become part of this case.
Well, that's assuming that she's the one who's killing them.
Whoever. I mean, the fact is
Well,
there was a significant rise in the number of deaths and sudden and serious collapses of babies at the unit.
Yeah.
Like that, for whatever reason, for
Yes.
whatever cause. So that internal review did not have any outcomes.
No.
And I'm saying babies E to P
could have
paid
been
the price.
saved yeah, okay. Possibly could have been saved.
I'm not putting that on Letby at this point.
No.
I'm saying the internal review was
Yes.
problematic.
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to take you to where it began, which, as far as we know, was the 8th of June, 2015. So baby A and baby B were twins. And baby A died on that night at 8:58 p.m. His twin sister, baby B, collapsed the next night but was revived. And baby C and baby D died over the next 2 weeks. So the court was told that these collapses were unexpected, in that although the babies were premature, their condition immediately before they collapsed was relatively stable, which they took from the nursing notes, the medical notes. And so then they had that review. Nothing came of that. By February 2016, 8 months later, another review was conducted because there had been a continuation of the rise in unexplained collapses and deaths on the unit. Obviously, throughout this time, Letby was still working. There was no reason for her not to be accordingly. And then in June 2016, some triplets were born. So these were baby O and P, and the third triplet was okay.
Okay.
So one of the triplets, baby O, died at 2 days old, and his brother, baby P, died the following day. And then another baby collapsed suddenly and unexpectedly the day after that. So it's reached this critical point where these babies are unexpectedly dying, even for babies in a neonatal unit. It was at that stage that Letby was removed from all clinical duties because of the concerns of senior consultants. So then 10 months later, April 2017, the senior doctors from the unit made contact with police, and a police investigation then commenced. During that investigation, a retired consultant paediatrician, Dr. Evans, was brought on to review clinical records of babies from the unit who had collapsed or died, and he became one of the key prosecution witnesses. And his evidence was, you would have been proud. Defence counsel challenged his evidence the entire way through, asked halfway through for him not to be allowed to give more evidence.
Nice.
For everything he'd set up to that point to be disregarded.
Nice.
But the trial judge allowed it all.
So when you say he was brought in by the police?
Yes.
And had he worked at that hospital?
Yes.
Oh, he had. So he'd retired from that hospital.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
I don't want to go too much into the different baby deaths.
No, it's very sad.
But it is very sad. I'll talk a little bit about those other babies because of the medical evidence. But I think some of the things that led to suspicion about Letby, as far as I can tell, was that she appeared to be fixated with being involved in the events in the intensive care nursery and involved herself unnecessarily with babies who had been designated to other nurses. So she was not sticking to her rostered patients. She created, it was alleged, false entries on certain documents to hide her activities.
I see. So there's entry on documents that don't support the prosecution case, so they then decide that she has falsified them.
Oh, Joe. How are we friends?
Yes.
She retained and took home a large number of handover sheets, which was against hospital policy. They were confidential documents, should never have been removed from the unit, and they found over 200 of them hidden under her bed in her unit, in her home. After the collapse or death of certain babies, or most of the babies, I think, she searched for the names of the babies' families on Facebook. And then also various handwritten notes were found at her home, and one of them concluded with the words, "I am evil, I did this." And the prosecution relied upon this as a confessional statement.
Okay.
Have you written those words ever?
I haven't.
No. I mean, why would you be writing words like that unless you've done something bad?
Well, I am sure there are a lot of people who write words like that or similar or say things like that who are not murderers.
I know. And actually, I think Kathleen Folbig is a case in point, but we'll leave that issue. The prosecution also relied on medical experts, hospital records, text messages, and statistical evidence to establish her pattern of involvement in the incidents. So the text messages and social media activity were an important part of the case because they coincided with incidents that were happening at the unit. They were dated and timed. It was said that they were somewhat similar to a live blogging of the events that were unfolding in the hospital.
Who is she text messaging?
I don't know.
Her boyfriend. I mean, that I would suspect is relevant.
Well, I don't know. The Court of Appeal didn't say who she was texting, just what the evidence was.
No.
They also explained how Letby deceived her colleagues into believing that the collapses were simply a natural worsening of children's underlying conditions.
Yeah, but you see, to accept that evidence, you've got to accept the premise that she's guilty.
Yes, I know.
You know, this is the problem I have with these prosecution narratives.
Well, they're presenting a case, Joe. The jury don't have to accept it.
No, that's right. But I mean, in the cases of child murder, incredibly emotional cases where obviously all right-thinking people, want to make sure that if there is a murderer, that person is caught and punished.
But having said that, there were a lot of people who supported her.
Okay, well, that's good because I suspect the medical evidence is going to be.
Beyond that I am evil note, there were other handwritten notes that included phrases such as, I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them.
Okay. Well.
And today is your birthday and you are not here and I am so sorry for that. And these notes were put forward to give insight into her mindset.
Of course. So she's a bit of an oddbod. I think you can't put it any higher than that, who doesn't necessarily follow the, work regime correctly.
Several medical documents had the falsified notes. She amended timings on several documents in an attempt to distance herself from incidents where babies had suddenly become unwell.
Well, you can appreciate why after the first 4 babies died and she's sort of questioned that after that she might be thinking, geez, if these babies are dying, I don't want to be involved in them.
All right, well, you're going to love this one. Yeah. The staff roster was also relied upon to show the jury that Letby was the one common denominator in the series of deaths and sudden collapses on the neonatal unit. The jury were told that many of the early incidents occurred overnight, and then when Letby was put onto day shifts, the collapses and deaths began occurring in the day, and that was corroborated by her own records of her shifts, so they could make sure.
After, therefore, because of. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc.
So have you heard of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy?
Oh, I haven't. But is this I know I'm thinking of the Washington sharpshooter. Now tell me I like the sound of this.
I knew you would like this. I
Texas
put it at the end.
Fallacy,
I knew you would have to take a detour.
Quick. Yep.
So this is from an article that I read.
Yep.
That was, not outright supporting Letby, but definitely was trying to give balanced opinions. And so it said the key piece of statistical evidence was a chart which showed that she was on duty every time one of the crimes of which she was accused occurred, but that none of the other nursing staff were. On the face of it, it seems quite damning. But when you think about it, it's unsurprising that Letby's column is the only one full of crosses. Any of the events at which she was not present, she would not have been charged with and consequently wouldn't appear on the chart.
Yes.
This is an example of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
Nice.
So this fallacy is named for a story about a Texan cowboy who likes to head out to his barn after a few drinks for target practice.
Yeah.
Invariably, the barn wall gets peppered with random bullet holes during the inebriated exercise, and purely by chance, some of these holes get clustered. One morning, the savvy sharpshooter gets out his paint cans and draws a target around this cluster of holes to give the impression of accuracy to anyone who didn't see the process by which they were made.
Nice.
And to draw attention away from the other more dispersed bullet holes.
Nice.
You like that?
I do.
The sharpshooter fallacy occurs when a conclusion is drawn based only on data consistent with a given hypothesis, ignoring data that doesn't support the proposed conclusion.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
Texas sharpshooter. Is it fallacy or hypothesis? What is it? Texas
fallacy.
Yeah,
Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
All right, good. I'm going to use that one. I'll bring it up in another episode.
And one of the things that article also said was that the table that they relied on did not include 6 other deaths that occurred during the same period, but for which she wasn't charged, and the jury wasn't told about those. So, yes, I accept there are.
Yeah. Yeah, so that is about putting things in context, and I do say that occasionally on this podcast. You've got to put information in context. So looking at all baby deaths over the period and then putting what's happened in relation to her in the context of that, I think is important.
I mean, that was just one article I read about those 6 other babies, and I don't know what their causes of death were. Like, they may have been explicable, So
yeah, well, I suspect all of the babies' deaths were explicable. The question is whether the explanations that they were given were accurate. But that's what I mean.
I don't know if they were 6 who didn't become suspicious.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm just saying what was in that article.
Yeah.
Now, she gave evidence, and she denied intentionally causing harm to any of the babies.
Mm-hmm.
She provided explanations for the various pieces of circumstantial evidence. She said she was one of the newest qualified intensive care nurses on the unit, and she was enthusiastic and very committed to her job.
Okay.
For why she was looking after other babies.
Yep.
She said she searched regularly on Facebook for people who came into her mind, and those searches for the bereaved families should be seen in the context of the hundreds of other searches she had made.
There you go.
She said she had taken the handover sheets home by accident and then forgotten about them. 200, like that's a lot.
Well, I don't know. Maybe you get 10 a shift, and then that's only 20 shifts.
But
I mean,
you're not meant to take any of them.
Okay, but I mean, I don't know what form these take, or maybe she's got a folder that she walks around with, and they're in there, and she just throws that in her bag when she goes home,
and then hides it under her mattress.
Well, because guess what, people, she's starting to be in the frame for a murder, and she's like, "Jeepers, it's going to look really sus if they find all these sitting here. Better hide them somewhere under my mattress." Sounds good.
I've read a lot of articles about this, so some of this is opinions of people who. Okay. During her original trial, it was 14 days that she spent being questioned.
Oh, my Lord. By whom? Police?
No, during the trial.
Oh, sorry. Her evidence was 14 days.
Yeah.
That's exhausting.
Several observers noted that she seemed aloof and indifferent.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, the
At
Lindy
times,
Chamberlain effect.
She squirmed and seemed to tie herself in knots.
Yeah, the Lindy Chamberlain fallacy, we should say.
We should. That should be a real thing. She claimed she couldn't remember things, like the death of a baby she had texted colleagues about, or searching for those parents online, the dead parents online. So she was not giving consistent
Oh, my Lord.
stuff she'd said before.
Sure. Okay. Let's just put this in context. She looks after a lot of babies. And even though we say these are babies that have died, I mean, there's 17 of them.
I know.
And don't forget, she's not taking her own contemporaneous notes about what's going on. She then the hospital have their notes. She then has to rely on her memory months. I mean, it's 10 months later before they even make a complaint to the police, isn't it?
Well, 10 months after the second review.
10 months, yeah. So this is you're trying to recall things that happened much, much earlier.
I
you
know.
don't have contemporaneous notes, and then let's just understand what it means to be giving evidence for 14 days straight.
Oh, I can't imagine.
And the idea is she tied herself in knots. I mean, I use this example all the time. So Oscar Wilde, one of the greatest intellects of the 19th century, poet, playwright, novelist, is cross-examined in his trial for sodomy back at the end of the 19th century. Admittedly, he's cross-examined by an absolute expert QC. But that went for 3 days. And by the end of the 3 days, he finally, and this is a man of incredible intellect, finally says something that hurts him and then just completely crumbles. If somebody like that crumbles after 3 days of cross-examination, a lass who isn't involved in, oral or written advocacy.
Well, and I mean, let's think about the fact that if you are arrested by police, they cannot hold you for more than 8 hours for questioning, and only half of that time can be active questioning. So there is, I know. All right. So what was problematic about the medical evidence? So the evidence for the air embolus cases.
So this is injecting air into the
IV. Was given by primarily Dr. Evans, another doctor called Dr. Bowen, and a Professor Arthurs. Now, neither Dr. Evans nor Dr. Bowen had any significant direct experience of patients with air embolus. Hold, please. In his evidence at trial, Dr. Evans explained that he was proud that in 30 years of practice as a consultant paediatrician in Swansea, there had been no neonatal cases of air embolus on the unit at which he worked.
He was aware of.
Well, that he was aware of. Dr. Bowen said she had seen only one case in her clinical practice, and this was when she had been a senior registrar in Leicester. But they did have significant regard to an article, a detailed medical article by two doctors on air embolus, and that was continuously cited and relied upon by them for the indicators and what you would expect and that sort of thing. So they were looking at the patients, the victims, and the signs and the medical history and records, and comparing it, I guess, to what these two experts in air embolism cases had written about in a medical journal.
Yeah, so because let's understand this. It's not like they find an air bubble in a IV.
No.
This is all being reconstructed months and months or possibly years later. And so they have to look at the chart, which gives the indication of the symptoms that the baby is experiencing. And then they reverse engineer from that what is causing those symptoms, and they latch onto air embolism. I mean, are the symptoms, referable to other illnesses?
So, well, let me come to that. So baby A had needed some respiratory assistance prior to the collapse, the fatal collapse. And baby B, but he was breathing room air at the time that he died. Baby B, who had been the first twin born, had required more initial resuscitation. Then her brother, she'd been born blue and floppy with a low heart rate, but was, at the time of her collapse, thought to be progressing well and to be stable.
Yes.
So Letby was the night nurse on shift when baby B collapsed, and she was standing by the cot of baby A at the time he collapsed.
Yes.
Baby D, I'm just going to tell you about how they died. Baby D was born at 37 weeks and died after 36 hours alive.
Very sad.
He was settled and stable at 1:30 a.m, according to the nurse on duty, who was not Letby, on 22nd of June. Letby admitted that she made an unsigned manuscript entry at 1:14 on that night, and baby D suffered 3 collapses between 1:30 a.m. and 3:45 a.m. and was unable to be resuscitated the third time, so had been resuscitated twice.
Who resuscitated him the previous 2 times?
Other staff. I don't know. Dr. Bowen said baby D had been born in good condition. Her pneumonia had stabilised and she was recovering at the time of her collapse.
Okay, let's just put that in context. This is a premature baby. So, they've already got comorbidities. She's got pneumonia as well.
But she
and they're in
she
good
was
condition.
recovering
So
at the time of her collapse.
So in good condition means in good condition for a premature baby who has pneumonia.
I noted that at the start. I said they're all babies in the neonatal unit.
Yes.
So prosecution's experts readily admitted that research on air embolism in babies is very limited. The paper that they relied upon was a 1989 paper, and it was by 2 Canadian academics. A lot of it had to do with references to skin colour changes that are associated with air embolism. So I think it's like the pink colours and,
Yeah. I mean, how old are the people that they're writing about from the article? Are they newly born babies?
It was, I don't know, but
we all know anybody's had any
the
dealings
number
with
of cases in the study was limited to 53.
Adults?
But they were babies.
They were babies.
Yeah. All right. So the medical expert evidence was that according to the signifiers and the medical information from the journal article, this was consistent with air embolism.
Was it consistent with anything else?
They did not say.
No.
The insulin cases, we had a different expert evidence here, I'm pretty sure. So Professor Hindmarsh was a consultant pediatric endocrinologist. She gave evidence that the insulin had been contaminated, that 2 bags had been doctored with similar levels of insulin.
What?
Yeah. While the integrity of the sampling and biochemical testing was challenged by defence, Letby gave evidence that she admitted both of the babies had been poisoned by insulin but denied being responsible.
Interesting. When they say they had been doctored, I mean, that's, how can you say that? You can say that the insulin bags didn't have the right amount of insulin in them.
Well, because skeptics have questioned whether the lab test used to measure insulin and C-peptide in the case was as robust as the prosecution had claimed. It's called an immunoassay test and works by using antibodies to detect and measure substances.
Yeah, so they're measuring the level of insulin in these poor little babies after they've passed away.
Yeah, but when you find high levels of insulin in a baby but low levels of this byproduct C-peptide, there's only one conclusion: the insulin is not natural and therefore had to have been administered from the outside, because if you have naturally occurring insulin, you do create C-peptides, but not with this big disparity of count or whatever they do.
Yes.
And so one of the babies in the case had extremely high levels of insulin in his blood and a C-peptide level that was so low that it was unmeasurable. The second baby had an insulin level more than 4 times higher than the C-peptide level. Again, an indication it had not been naturally produced. So I don't think there was much doubt that they had artificial insulin.
Level of insulin. But I want to know how they determine these bags of insulin are doctored.
Well, with the immunoassay test.
Okay.
I guess they didn't get a whole bag of insulin,
Sure, but I mean, they say I took it to mean that the dose or whatever had been doctored, had been put.
No, it was the IV bag, like the
the
actual bags
had
themselves.
Been doctored in inverted commas.
It wasn't directed at a particular baby. Just that next time someone needed insulin, they were going to get more
insulin than
they needed.
Yeah, but to say that it's doctored, as opposed to it's got insulin in it which it shouldn't have in it. To say it's doctored sounds like it's done deliberately. Because
I think it was due to the fact that there were similar levels of extra insulin in both, which indicated it wasn't inadvertent.
It doesn't indicate that the person had deliberately done it. It could have been inadvertent in 2 bags. I mean, I don't know how these things are mixed up.
Okay, well, you should have been on the jury. All right.
Yeah.
So midway through the trial, Dr. Evans became the subject of a defence application.
Yeah.
Any further evidence should be excluded. Any evidence already given should be disregarded.
Nice.
He'd given evidence in relation to 7 babies by that point.
Mm.
And so that application was based on a submission that he was not an independent witness.
Mm.
So they alleged that he had constructed theories to support the charges rather than forming an independent opinion on the facts, because he had come on as the police investigator.
That's exactly what I said about police expert witnesses in a previous episode, that they don't use a scientific method. They don't follow where the evidence leads them. They look for the evidence that supports the answer they want to get to.
But so they didn't use a police officer. They went out and got an expert, and you're still going to criticise them for doing that.
Well, no.
So what expert can they ever use,
I'm criticising the expert's approach. That's what I'm criticising.
Okay, but they got someone who's not part of the police force. They said, here's a retired consultant with medical expertise to come in and look at the situation. What else are they meant to do?
Well, I think probably they should have got a second opinion. Would have been helpful.
They had Dr. Bowen as well.
Wow. Okay. Well,
I don't know what would keep you happy there.
Well, I don't know how the police procurement process could have been better, but I do know that the approach that this doctor took is not following the scientific method, which
that's what defence alleged. What evidence have you got to say that he did it that way?
Well, because it seems that there's some significant questions over this conviction, and he is the chief witness. And halfway through the trial, the defence say he should not, all of his evidence should be struck out and he should give no more evidence. I mean, that's a big call.
Of course defence are going to say that. You would say that.
Well, we've had so many trials where defence don't say that. And
well,
I sit here
the
going, what
judge
is the defence doing?
refused the application.
Yeah, okay.
He emphasised that it was important to contextualise the role of Dr. Evans at the various stages of the investigation into the events at the unit. His responses to questioning by defence were relevant to the jury's assessment of his evidence and the evidence in the trial as a whole. They could be made the subject of comment and submissions at the end of the trial, but did not render the evidence inadmissible. And I think that's absolutely fair.
Well, the problem is it's placing too much faith in the jury's ability to decide, between experts or understand, this kind of complex scientific evidence. Are the defence experts called?
There were.
Yeah.
Anyway, so at the close of the prosecution case, they made a no case to answer submission, which was refused.
No, okay.
All right. Now, the arguments put forward by defence for the no, so then on appeal, they appealed that decision about
no
the
case,
refusal of the no case.
Yeah.
And they said that the scientific basis for air embolus was so weak, it failed to provide the level of reliability required. The available research relevant to air embolus was extremely limited, not enough for the prosecution to show they had produced the best evidence available on the topic.
Interesting.
Yes. And that none of the expert witnesses had sufficient clinical experience to enable them to give expert evidence.
Because, you're not supposed to call experts who just go, I've read an article and it says this.
No.
You're supposed to get experts and go, I have professional experience of this happening.
But I think thankfully, and I think the Court of Appeal noted this, there aren't that many of these cases in babies. And so to find experts who had practical experience in that, I think was quite difficult, which is a good thing. You don't want to have a whole lot of babies.
No, but they then go and rely on or allow this evidence in or say this evidence is fine. I mean, they should have gone, so we're going to just throw all that evidence out. And so all of those charges are all out. All this air embolism
and
stuff's
so what
gone.
happens to those babies, Joe, and the families of those
nothing
babies?
happens to those babies.
Like they were killed
to God. Well, sorry, no, they died. They passed away.
But there was
whether they killed or not is the question.
No natural cause of death.
Well, when you do air quotes, I mean, the evidence that they had air bubbles put into their IV is done based on the autopsy.
But for a baby that was otherwise stable and settled to suddenly collapse and die and not be able to point. So you're saying we can't use air embolus because there's not enough babies who die of that?
No, because, there's not enough evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Absolutely. The expert evidence is not up to it. You can't do it. And so, and it may be that these babies passed away from it. I said to you, what are the symptoms the babies showed? What are they also consistent? What other things are they consistent with? And I mean, I don't know. You don't know. We're not doctors, sure. But was that looked at? I don't know. But it might have been that that's also consistent with some other things.
All right. Well, the appeal also sought to introduce fresh evidence.
Yay. Love a bit of fresh evidence.
So one of them was a report by a fellow called Dr. Shu Li. He was a co-author of the paper that the prosecution relied upon to help form their expert evidence. And so he had provided a fresh report dated the 10th of March, 2024, which supports the applicant or the Letby's contention that Dr. Evans and Dr. Bowen wrongly used skin discoloration as a means of diagnosing air embolus. So he apparently did not know that his paper was being relied upon in the original trial. He didn't find out until afterwards.
And that's why I'm thinking, why don't they just call up these experts in Canada and say, hi, can you give us some expert evidence? We'll fly you over.
I didn't run the prosecution.
No, I know, but I just,
anyway.
I mean, it's expensive, but you're running a trial that's running for 9 months. I mean.
So when he found out about that, he wrote this report. And so the core point raised by this evidence defence said is that prosecution witnesses wrongly diagnosed air embolus on the basis of a variety of skin discoloration, whereas Dr. Lee's evidence said only bright pink vessels is truly diagnostic of air embolus.
Interesting.
So the Court of Appeal dismissed that. They said they're not persuaded by the defence submission that the accused could not reasonably have been expected to seek evidence from Dr. Lee before or during the trial.
Oh,
Wasn't
I see.
fresh.
So they say it's not fresh, so we're not considering it. They don't actually consider the merits of it. They get rid of it on a technical basis.
Yeah, they said the interests of justice require the accused's whole case to be put forward at trial unless there is a good reason why that could not have been done.
And I said, well, if the prosecution are calling this, they had the best evidence rule. They should have called these experts who wrote the article and said, what do you think of this?
And maybe defence should have as well.
Well, certainly the Court of Appeal thing. I think that's rough when the prosecution bear the burden of proof. They just reverse the burden of proof when when you get to an appeal.
Your opinions are very difficult to follow at times.
Well, I'm very cranky about new and fresh evidence. I wrote a whole thesis on it.
I know.
It is one of my pet peeves.
All right. So Dr. Lee's opinion was never asked during the trial or the investigation leading to the trial. He only had opinions after the convictions. He provided those opinions via webcam and stated it was just that one colour. So several experts have publicly criticised that air embolism theory, but hardly any of them have seen all of the medical evidence. One expert who has seen all the evidence was the man who advised Letby's defence during her original trial. And
this is all what the Court of Appeal are saying.
He was also a retired consultant neonatologist, Dr. Mike Hall, and he didn't actually give evidence during her trial. So defence didn't call him. But he told media in an article I read he believes there were significant flaws in the prosecution's medical evidence and said he believed the prosecution experts overstated how stable the babies were before they collapsed and died, saying phrases such as the baby was really, really well were given by the prosecution expert witnesses on several occasions for several of the babies. And it is my view they weren't really, really well. They had signs of significant illness. I think what the prosecution experts said was misleading for the jury. So that was afterwards. All right. So that, there was a lot. It was like a 70-something page judgment. And I did read it all, but it's a lot of medical evidence. The essence of it is the big criticism is the air embolus evidence because Dr. Shu has come out and said this. And also the appeal ground on the juror misconduct, I think, is going to be pursued further as well. So I'm going to talk about that one. But so all of the grounds of appeal were dismissed. Really interesting reading, very clear decisions by the Court of Appeal there. I followed their reasoning and agreed with them. No surprise there.
Okay.
All right. But so I'll just tell you about this juror misconduct. And then, it's not there. And then we'll keep going. So it was this situation where one of the jurors, there was an anonymous call made to say that he had been talking about the case in a cafe.
Oh.
Yes. And that he'd been saying things like we'd all decided from the start that she was guilty, something like that.
Okay.
And so they did investigate that. They rang, it was an email.
Right.
And so they tried to email back, could we get some more information? Who are you? And there was no response. And a couple of days went past and they discussed it. And I think they tried a second time to contact the author. Nothing came of it. And so they just kept going. And then there was I think a defense application or suggestion that they take it further. And so they spoke to the juror in question and he said he'd never been to that cafe, but his girlfriend used to go and she'd gotten into a big fight with the owner of the cafe.
Wow. And
police were called.
Wow.
And it was right after that this tip came in.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And so they looked into it and there was a police report of that altercation. There was nothing to say that the juror himself had ever been to that cafe. And so the court felt, okay, well, we're fine. This juror is not tainted.
Yeah.
That wasn't true. It was a revenge thing. Yeah. And so they just continued on. And so they raised that in the Court of Appeal as well. And the Court of Appeal talked about it in detail and said, well, they did everything they could. They tried to contact, blah, blah, blah. And then they said it's not their job to interfere with the discretion of the trial judge in the decisions that they made. to allow that jury to continue. But so I did read that Letby's counsel has included that in their current complaints. But interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting. I must say, I think probably the Court of Appeal were right in that one, or the trial judge as well. I mean, what else can you do? And the idea that 12 people had at the start of 12 people who don't know each other at all have at the start of trial gone, we're just going to absolutely bang her up for all this.
Well,
it's a bit.
And actually one of the other things was that the jury deliberated for a long time.
Yeah. So,
I can't remember how long, but it was days.
Yeah, so...
Not indicative of a predetermined verdict.
No. Well, it could be, it could be one holdout, you don't know. But it just doesn't sound likely.
But juror misconduct, I think, is such an interesting topic.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was one of the other grounds of appeal.
Yep.
So then that was the end of it. Appeal dismissed. Sorry, Letby.
Yep.
Whole life sentence.
Yes.
There had been some charges where verdicts were not reached.
Yes.
And so the prosecution actually retried one of those babies, baby K. Baby K, really sad. She was born at 25 weeks, so really premature. She had to have a breathing tube. Neonatal unit staff were aware of the delivery of such a premature baby. Letby, who was working on a night shift, was involved in a series of messages with the colleague about this little baby. She was born at 2:12. At sometime shortly after 3:30 a.m., so an hour and a bit later, the nurse allocated to look after baby K left the unit to go and speak to the parents. At the time she left, she was content that the baby's condition was stable. Letby was left to look after baby K, and when the nurse allocated to baby K came back at about 3:47, the baby was being treated by the consultant, Dr. J. Aram. The baby had gone downhill. He found Letby next to the cot. The baby's condition was rapidly deteriorating. Letby could see the baby was desaturating but was doing nothing to help her. She had not raised an alarm or called for assistance, and the baby's breathing tube had been dislodged. So that was the case for that one. So she did die, that poor little baby, and she was convicted of that charge on the retrial after a 4-week trial.
Weak circumstantial case, I describe it as, yes.
After hearing the verdict being taken to the cells, she turned to the judge, Letby did, with outstretched arms and said, "I'm innocent." And I do always come back to the point that if these people who have been convicted have been wrongly convicted, it is just so heartbreaking for them.
Absolutely.
All right, so what's happened since the Court of Appeal's decision? Well, we've got an inquiry into the hospital.
Yeah.
So the British government in 2023 set up a public inquiry. It's the Thirlwall Inquiry, and that is being run by a Casey Thirlwall. She's got a string of qualifications after her name.
Yes.
And so they're looking at 3 things: the experiences of the Countess of Chester Hospital and other relevant National Health services of all the parents of the babies named in the indictment. So really digging into everything that they experienced. The conduct of those working at the Countess of Chester Hospital, including the board, managers, doctors, nurses, midwives, with regard to the actions of Lucy Letby while she was employed there, and whether suspicion should have been raised earlier, the responses to concerns about Letby, and whether the culture management and governance structures and processes contributed to the failure to protect babies from Lucy Letby, which is interesting. So that started, I think, in September last year, and evidence and submissions finished in January. So there was a closing statement already made by Thirlwall, and she'll publish her findings in their autumn.
Right.
So that must be soonish.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so maybe September. So I mean, there is a lot of scrambling to try and say that they didn't mishandle the situation, that they took appropriate action, that if they had suspicions, they dealt with them properly. But there's been a lot in the media about the delay in reporting and the delay in taking action. all still, I think, predicated on Letby being the offender.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. The last thing that I need to talk to you about is that in February of this year.
Oh, okay, really?
Yeah,
That was
very
recent.
recent.
Okay.
The CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, received an application from Letby's lawyer to look into her case, and they are going to look into it.
Accepted it, yes.
That's right.
Okay. So Criminal Cases Review Commission is the publicly funded body which you can apply to after you've exhausted your appeals if you say that you are still innocent.
Yes.
And they may or may not take your case on.
So what has been one of the primary pieces of evidence here is a report that was released reviewing the cases of the 14 babies that Letby had been convicted of murdering or harming. It was compiled by a panel of 14 neonatal and paediatric specialists from around the world and found there was no medical evidence to support wrongdoing. Instead, the deaths and injuries were the result of natural causes or just bad medical care.
Yeah, there you go.
Dr. Shu led that.
Dr. Shu led that, the Canadian guy who wrote...
sorry, Dr. Shu Lee. I keep calling him Dr. Shu. It's Dr. Lee.
Dr. Lee.
First name Shu.
Okay, and he is the Canadian expert on...
He said at a press conference in Canada, in our opinion, the medical evidence doesn't support murder in any of these babies. The report indicated there were unsafe delays in diagnosis and treatment at the Countess of Chester Hospital, as well as poor resuscitation and intubation skills. Poor supervision of junior doctors.
Nice. It's terrible.
Yes, but interesting.
Interesting, yes.
And also found a lack of teamwork and trust between the health professionals. So not only are they saying that she's not guilty, but they're saying let's look at the hospital broadly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, prosecuting doctors and I assume nurses as well is difficult because you've got to get beyond just bad medical care.
Yes.
You've got to, well, if you're prosecuting for murder. And this is exactly the problem they had in the Patel case with Dr. Patel, or Dr. Death as we called him here in Australia, who was prosecuted for murder. And really in the end, he that was all thrown out. And I think he pleaded guilty to one grievous bodily harm.
Yeah. And also I know a case recently where a doctor was found to have done something that was not best practice, but was not negligent. And so there was no further action. Yeah. And I'm thinking if a doctor's not doing best practice, they shouldn't be doing it. Okay. You know what I mean?
Like, let's all hold them to a high standard. I agree, but I mean, you know, as a lawyer, that negligence is a high bar to clear. You know, you've got to be.
I know, but when it's life and death, which this one was,
Okay.
Anyway, Letby's lawyer, a fellow called Mark McDonald, has said the new medical findings from the international experts demolish the case against her.
Boom.
If the experts are correct, no crime was committed. So he put in that application to the CCRC. A spokesperson for the CCRC said it was not possible for the commission, whose job is not to determine guilt or innocence, to say how long its review would take. So we'll have to watch this space. I'm sure Letby will be watching that space.
She's got plenty of time on her hands to watch it. So.
Whole life.
Yeah.
All right. I think that was everything I wanted to say. I you know, like, you get torn, don't you? Because if she's suffered a miscarriage of justice, and this was someone who had devoted her time to caring for these little tiny babies, to then be convicted of murdering them, if she's innocent, would be soul destroying.
Yeah.
But there are so many babies involved, and it took so long for it to come to light and for action to be taken. And my thoughts are firmly with the families of those babies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But don't forget, we're also dealing with the NHS, the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, which is just a byword for incompetence.
I don't know anything about that.
Oh, my Lord. You know, it's just, I mean, you're coming at it, I assume, from the standard of medical care we get here in Australia, which is absolutely streets ahead of what you get in the United Kingdom.
Oh, really?
Oh, it's just primitive over there.
Well, I'm also going to keep track of that Thurl Wall inquiry and see what the findings are.
Be interesting.
But so there we go.
Thank you, Lizzie. I mean, it was harrowing dealing with child deaths, but yeah, excellent.
Thanks, Joe.
Excellent cases, as always.
Oh, thanks, Joe.
All right.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please rate and review or like and subscribe. It all helps Lizzie and I keep this podcast going. If you're interested in clips, you can look at them on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Justice Matters Pod. See you next episode.